On a quiet street in Moscow, Idaho, where university life had always been associated with late-night conversations, friendships, and ordinary routines, a terrifying mystery began unfolding before sunrise. The house at 1122 King Road looked like any other student rental. It was a place where young people studied, celebrated birthdays, cooked meals together, and built memories during their college years. But on the morning of November 13, 2022, that house became the center of one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in modern American history. Inside were 4 University of Idaho students whose lives had been suddenly and violently taken. They were not just names in a criminal case. They were daughters, sons, friends, classmates, and people with futures that would never happen. The investigation that followed would stretch across multiple states, involve months of forensic work, generate worldwide attention, and eventually lead investigators to a suspect whose identity shocked the community. But before there was a suspect, before there was an arrest, and before there was a courtroom battle, there were 4 young people simply living their lives. 21-year-old Kaylee Gonsalves was a senior at the University of Idaho studying general studies with an emphasis in business and leadership. Friends described Kaylee as energetic, ambitious, and deeply connected to the people around her. She had recently been preparing for the next chapter of her life. After graduation, she planned to move forward with new opportunities and was celebrating what she believed was the beginning of a new stage. Her closest friend and roommate, Maddie Mogan, was also 21 years old. Maddie was studying marketing and was known by friends as someone who brought positivity into the lives of those around her. The two had been best friends for years. Their friendship was one of the defining relationships of their college experience. They were often seen together, attending events, spending time with friends, and sharing everyday moments that seemed ordinary at the time but would later become treasured memories for those who knew them. 20-year-old Oksana Kernodle was a junior at the university studying marketing. Those close to Oksana described her as outgoing, caring, and someone who valued her relationships. She was dating Ethan Chapin, also 20 years old. Ethan was a student athlete who was studying recreation, sport, and tourism management. Friends described him as someone who enjoyed being around people and brought energy wherever he went. The 4 students were part of a larger community of young adults navigating college life, balancing classes, friendships, relationships, and plans for the future. Nothing about that weekend suggested that their lives were about to become the center of a national investigation. The evening before the murders, November 12, 2022, appeared to begin like many other weekends for college students. The University of Idaho was preparing for the final weeks of the semester. Students attended gatherings, spent time with friends, and enjoyed a typical Saturday night. According to investigators, Kaylee and Maddie were seen at a local bar in downtown Moscow before returning home. Oksana and Ethan had also spent time together that evening. Investigators later determined that all 4 victims were back at the King Road residence during the early morning hours of November 13. The home was shared by 6 people. Kaylee and Maddie lived upstairs. Oksana and Ethan were on the 2nd floor. 2 other roommates lived on the 1st floor. Those 2 surviving roommates would later become important witnesses in the investigation. According to investigators, the murders occurred sometime in the early morning hours. The exact sequence of events inside the house became one of the central questions investigators worked to answer. What happened inside those walls? Who entered the home? How long was the person there? And most importantly, who was responsible? At first, investigators had almost no answers. The first major turning point came hours later. As the morning progressed, friends became concerned after being unable to reach some of the residents. A call was eventually made to emergency services shortly before noon. When police arrived at the residence, they discovered a scene that immediately changed the direction of the investigation. 4 victims were found deceased inside the home. Authorities quickly determined that this was not a typical incident. The victims had suffered fatal injuries consistent with an edged weapon. Investigators later identified the weapon as likely being a large knife, although the actual weapon was not recovered. The Moscow Police Department immediately began processing what would become one of the largest crime scenes in the region's history. The quiet college town was suddenly facing an unimaginable question. Who could have entered a student home in the middle of the night and committed such a violent crime? In the early days, investigators faced a challenge familiar to many homicide cases, separating facts from assumptions. There was a crime scene. There were victims. But there was no obvious suspect. The public wanted answers quickly. Rumors spread online. Social media became filled with theories, speculation and accusations. But investigators repeatedly warned that misinformation could damage the case. Behind the scenes, law enforcement agencies began working through thousands of pieces of evidence. The investigation expanded rapidly. The Moscow Police Department was joined by the Idaho State Police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Detectives began interviewing witnesses, reviewing surveillance footage, collecting forensic evidence, and reconstructing the victim's final hours. Every detail mattered. A phone record, a camera image, a footprint, a DNA sample, a vehicle seen near the home. Any one of those pieces could become the clue that unlocked the case. But at that moment, investigators still faced a major obstacle. They did not know who they were looking for. One of the earliest questions centered around the surviving roommates. Investigators determined that 2 roommates had been inside the house during the attack but were not harmed. Authorities later explained that the roommates had been asleep and that their accounts helped investigators build a timeline of the morning. According to the probable cause affidavit released after an arrest was made, one roommate reported seeing a person dressed in dark clothing and wearing a mask leaving the home in the early morning hours. That observation would later become one of the many details investigators examined. But in those first days, it was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. As detectives began reconstructing the timeline, another mystery emerged. A vehicle had been seen near the King Road residence during the early morning hours. Investigators would later identify that vehicle as a white Hyundai Elantra. At the beginning, they did not know who owned it or whether it was connected to the crime. They needed more information. They needed a connection between evidence and a person. And they needed something that could transform a mystery into a criminal case. That breakthrough would not happen overnight. It would take weeks of investigation, forensic analysis, and careful evidence collection. Because while the world was searching for answers, investigators were quietly following the trail. A trail that would eventually lead them hundreds of miles away from Moscow, Idaho, to a man who had once studied criminal behavior himself. A man named Brian Koberger. For investigators in Moscow, Idaho, the days following November 13, 2022, became a race against time. A community was searching for answers. Families were waiting for information. And detectives were trying to solve a case where the most important question remained unanswered. Who had entered the King Road home that night? The investigation began with one of the most difficult tasks in any homicide case. Reconstructing what happened when almost no one witnessed it. The crime scene itself became the starting point. Every room, every object, and every possible piece of evidence had to be carefully documented. Investigators collected photographs, biological samples, digital information, and physical evidence from the home. The process was slow and methodical. A single mistake could affect the entire case. At the same time, detectives began building a timeline of the victim's final hours. They examined phone records. They reviewed surveillance footage. They spoke with friends, classmates, neighbors, and anyone who could provide information about the events before the murders. The goal was simple: find the missing pieces. As investigators worked through the evidence, the case gained national attention. The University of Idaho community was shaken. Students expressed fear and uncertainty. Many people wondered whether the person responsible was still nearby. For weeks, authorities provided limited public information. This created frustration among some members of the public who wanted immediate answers. But investigators repeatedly emphasized that releasing unconfirmed details could harm the investigation. Behind the scenes, hundreds of investigators were working through thousands of tips. According to law enforcement officials, more than 20,000 tips and numerous interviews were conducted during the investigation. Each lead had to be evaluated. Some would matter. Many would not. That is the reality of major criminal investigations. The answer is often hidden among enormous amounts of information. One of the most important pieces of evidence came from surveillance footage. Investigators began examining cameras around the area near the King Road residence. They were looking for unusual activity during the early morning hours. According to the probable cause affidavit later released, investigators found video footage showing a vehicle traveling near the home around the time of the murders. The vehicle appeared to be a white Hyundai Elantra. At first, investigators did not know who owned it. They needed to identify the driver. This became one of the first major investigative challenges. A vehicle alone does not prove a crime. Thousands of people could own the same model. The question was this simply a car passing through the area? Or was it connected to what happened inside the house? As investigators searched for the owner of the Hyundai Elantra, another important discovery emerged. The investigation turned toward digital evidence. Modern criminal investigations often rely heavily on electronic records. Phones, computers, cameras, and online activity can reveal movements and connections. Investigators reviewed cell phone data to understand where certain individuals had been before and after the murders. They were looking for patterns. A person's location. A timeline. A connection between a suspect and a crime scene. According to court documents. Investigators later focused on cell phone records connected to Brian Kohberger. Those records became part of the evidence prosecutors presented. But perhaps the most significant forensic development came from DNA evidence. At the crime scene, investigators recovered genetic material from a knife sheath found near one of the victims. According to the probable cause affidavit, testing later identified DNA on the sheath that was linked to Brian Kohberger through a comparison with genetic information obtained during the investigation. The sheath itself became a major part of the prosecution's case. But DNA evidence alone was not the entire investigation. Detectives still needed to connect the evidence together. A criminal case is not built on one piece of information. It is built on a collection of facts that create a complete picture. The question was becoming clearer. Who was Brian Kohberger? And why was his DNA connected to the crime scene? Brian Kohberger was not a stranger to the world of criminal justice. Before his arrest, he had studied criminology. He had earned a bachelor's degree in psychology and later pursued graduate studies related to criminal justice. At the time of the murders, he was a PhD student in criminology at Washington State University. Located in Pullman, Washington, approximately a short drive from Moscow, Idaho. Investigators began examining his background and movements. According to court documents, they learned that Kohberger owned a white Hyundai Elantra. This vehicle matched the description investigators had been searching for. That connection became another important step in the investigation. A suspect was no longer just a name. Investigators now had a person whose vehicle, DNA, and cell phone records were being examined. As detectives built their case, they continued gathering additional evidence. They reviewed surveillance footage. They analyzed phone data. They examined travel patterns. They conducted interviews. Each piece added another layer. But investigators still needed to understand one thing. Why would a graduate student with an interest in criminology allegedly become connected to one of the most shocking crimes in Idaho history? That question would become central to the public discussion. But investigators had to focus on evidence, not assumptions. In late December 2022, the investigation moved dramatically forward. Authorities announced that Brian Kohberger had been arrested in Pennsylvania. At the time, he was staying at his parents' home in Monroe County. The arrest came after investigators had quietly developed enough evidence to obtain a warrant. The news shocked the nation. After weeks of uncertainty, the person accused of committing the murders had a name. But an arrest was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a legal process. Under American law, an accusation is not a conviction. A suspect is entitled to a defense. The prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And the evidence would eventually have to be tested inside a courtroom. Following his arrest, Kohberger was extradited back to Idaho. He appeared in court and was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. The prosecution argued that the evidence connected him to the crime. The defense, meanwhile, had the responsibility of challenging that evidence and presenting its own arguments. The case entered a new phase. The investigation had found a suspect. Now the justice system had to determine what happened. As the legal process continued, more details from investigators became public. Court documents revealed additional information about the prosecution's theory. They described evidence involving DNA, cell phone records, surveillance footage, and vehicle information. But many questions remained. The murder weapon had not been publicly recovered. The motive remained unclear. And the families of the victims were still searching for answers that evidence alone could not provide. Because even when investigators identify a suspect, a case is not only about proving what happened. It is also about understanding the lives that were lost. For the families of Kaylee Gonsalves, Madison Mogan, Exenaker Noddle, and Ethan Chapin, the investigation was never just about evidence. It was about 4 people who should have continued living their lives. 4 students who had plans. 4 families who had to face an unimaginable loss. The courtroom would eventually become the place where those questions would be examined. But before that could happen, prosecutors and defense attorneys would prepare for one of the most closely watched trials in the country. And at the center of it all was a question that had remained since the beginning. What exactly happened inside the King Road house that night? After Bryan Kohberger's arrest in December 2022, the investigation entered a new chapter. For nearly 7 weeks, the case had been defined by uncertainty. The public knew 4 University of Idaho students had been killed. They knew investigators were searching for answers. But they did not know who would be accused of committing the crime. Now, prosecutors had identified a suspect. The next challenge was proving their case in court. Because an arrest is not a conclusion. It is the beginning of a legal battle. When Kohberger appeared before an Idaho judge, he was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. The prosecution's case would rely on the evidence collected during the investigation. According to court filings, prosecutors planned to present evidence involving DNA, cell phone data, surveillance footage, and other investigative findings. The defense team, led by attorney Ann Taylor, would challenge the prosecution's interpretation of that evidence and defend Kohberger against the accusations. The case immediately became one of the most closely followed criminal proceedings in America. But while the public focused on the suspect, the legal system focused on something more important. Could the evidence meet the standard required for a conviction? In criminal trials, prosecutors must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That means they must convince a jury that the evidence leaves no reasonable alternative explanation. The defense does not have to prove innocence. Instead, it challenges the prosecution's case. This difference is one of the most important principles in the American justice system. And in the Idaho case, both sides prepared for a legal battle that could have lasted for months. As the case moved forward, prosecutors and defense attorneys fought over evidence. The defense requested access to investigative materials. The prosecution provided information gathered during the investigation. Court hearings addressed issues such as evidence disclosure, expert witnesses, and trial preparation. The judge overseeing the case made decisions about what information could be used and how the trial would proceed. Every ruling had the potential to influence the direction of the case. One of the biggest questions surrounding the case involved the evidence itself. The prosecution's arguments centered on the idea that multiple pieces of evidence connected Kohberger to the crime scene. Among the evidence discussed publicly were a DNA sample recovered from a knife sheath found at the scene, a white Hyundai Elantra connected to Kohberger, cell phone data that prosecutors argued placed him in relevant locations, surveillance footage that investigators said showed a vehicle consistent with his car near the residence. Each piece mattered. But evidence must be examined carefully. A courtroom does not decide cases based on public opinion. It decides them through testimony, documents, and legal arguments. Another major development came when prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty if Kohberger was convicted. The decision added another layer of complexity to the case. Capital cases involve additional legal procedures and require careful examination of evidence and circumstances. The defense continued preparing for trial while challenging aspects of the prosecution's case. As the trial approached, the case continued receiving intense media attention. The victims' families remained at the center of public concern. For them, the legal process was not simply about a courtroom. It was about seeking accountability for the loss of 4 people they loved. Kaylee Gonsalves, Madison Mogan, Exenaker Nottle, Ethan Chapin. Their names remained the focus of remembrance efforts, memorials, and conversations about the impact of violent crime on families and communities. Then, in 2025, a major change occurred. Bryan Kohberger agreed to a plea deal. Under the agreement, Kohberger pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty. The plea agreement brought a dramatic shift to a case that had been expected to become a lengthy trial. Instead of months of courtroom testimony, the case moved directly towards sentencing. During the plea hearing, Kohberger admitted responsibility for the crimes. The court accepted his guilty plea after determining that he understood the charges and the consequences of his decision. The families of the victims were then given the opportunity to speak during sentencing. Their statements described the deep impact of losing their loved ones. They spoke about memories. They spoke about pain. They spoke about lives interrupted. The legal process had reached its conclusion, but the emotional consequences would continue long after the courtroom closed. At sentencing, Kohberger received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was also sentenced for the burglary charge. The sentence ensured that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. For investigators, the case represented years of work. For prosecutors, it represented the conclusion of a criminal case. For the families, however, no sentence could undo what happened. Justice could provide accountability, but it could not restore the lives that were lost. Even after the conviction, some questions remained. The motive behind the murders was never fully explained publicly. Investigators and prosecutors presented evidence connecting Kohberger to the crime, but the reason behind the attack remained unclear. This is not unusual in criminal cases. Sometimes the evidence can answer who committed a crime and how it happened. But the question of why can remain unanswered. The Idaho murders also created broader conversations about several issues. The role of forensic evidence in solving modern crimes. The importance of careful investigation. The dangers of online speculation during active cases. And the impact that violent crimes have on communities far beyond the immediate victims. The case also showed the complexity of modern investigations. A single piece of evidence rarely solves a crime. Instead, investigators often build a case by connecting hundreds or thousands of details. A timeline. A location. A physical object. A digital record. A scientific test. Together, those pieces can transform uncertainty into answers. For Moscow, Idaho, the events of November 13, 2022, will remain a defining moment. A quiet college town became known worldwide because of an unimaginable tragedy. But behind the headlines were four individuals whose lives mattered long before their names appeared in news reports. Kaylee, Madison, Xana, Ethan. The most important part of any true crime story is not the investigation. It is remembering the people at the center of it. The Idaho murders remain a reminder that behind every criminal case are real families, real communities, and real consequences. The evidence may explain what happened. The courtroom may determine responsibility. But the memory of those lost belongs to the people who knew and loved them. And for the families of the four victims, the story did not end with a verdict. It continues through the lives they touched, the memories they left behind, and the unanswered emotions that remain after tragedy.